There was a moment when the prophet Nathan stood in the presence of King David and spoke a curse destined to ripple across future generations. "Because you have treated the word of the Lord with contempt, the sword shall remain in your household forever." The kingdom had no way of knowing that this sword would manifest in the form of Israel's most stunning man. A child born of David's own blood, fated to wound his father's heart more deeply than any opposing weapon could ever manage. His name was Absalom. From his very first breath, fate had inscribed tragedy into his future. Within the records of divine verdict, his narrative had been inscribed before any stone was hurled, before any plot was murmured in darkened hallways. Pay careful attention, because this is far more than simply a story about uprising. This is prophecy made flesh, where each kiss hides treachery, where each stolen crown requires a price, where physical beauty transforms into the tool of destruction. Observe how destiny's threads pull ever tighter. A violated sister pleading for justice that will never arrive. A father who rules, paralyzed by the weight of his own sinful history. And a radiant prince whose desires burn more intensely than the Jerusalem sun. The judgment of the Lord advances like a gathering tempest, measured, unavoidable, fearsome, and once it strikes, even the woodland trees will serve as instruments of execution. Among every son born to King David within Jerusalem's royal palace, one particular son stood apart from all others. Absalom was his name, and he held the position of David's third son, born to Maacah, who was herself the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. This lineage meant that Absalom carried royal heritage from both his father's line and his mother's line, making her royalty twice over. Yet what genuinely distinguished Absalom from all his brothers and from every other man throughout Israel was his remarkable physical presence. The holy writings in 2 Samuel, chapter 14, verse 25, inform us that throughout all of Israel, no one received such praise for their beauty as Absalom did. From the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, not a single imperfection could be found on him. Every inch of this man exhibited perfection. Not one flaw existed anywhere on his body. His facial features possessed extraordinary handsomeness. His physique appeared strong and commanding, and throughout the entire kingdom, people spoke constantly about his appearance. Yet, even more exceptional than his unblemished features was the hair that grew from Absalom's head. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 26 provides a description of how he would cut his hair, explaining that at the conclusion of each year he would trim it, because when it grew heavy upon him, he would cut it. When he weighed what he had cut from his head, it measured 200 shekels according to the royal measurement. His hair grew with such thickness and length that annually, when the weight became too much for him to carry, he would have it cut. And each time he did this, the hair weighed approximately 5 pounds. Picture the vision of this prince moving through the streets of Jerusalem, his spectacular hair flowing freely, his flawless face capturing every person's gaze. Absalom fully understood the impact he created on those around him. He moved with the assurance of someone who had never heard the word no, never experienced rejection, never been ignored. Inside the palace, among his numerous brothers and sisters, he was distinctive. David had fathered many sons through different wives, but Absalom possessed something extraordinary, a compelling presence that caused people to pause and look. He received admiration, celebration, and favor from many who viewed him as the obvious selection to eventually occupy his father's throne. Absalom had a sister whose name was Tamar, born from the same mother. She possessed beauty just as her brother possessed handsomeness, and she remained a virgin, which was appropriate for a king's unmarried daughter. However, Tamar had another half-brother named Amnon, who was David's firstborn son and the one who would inherit the throne. And 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 1 informs us that Amnon, David's son, loved her. But this feeling was not genuine love. It was an unhealthy fixation, a twisted craving that devoured Amnon until he became physically unwell from wanting something he was forbidden to possess. His companion, Jonadab, described in the 3rd verse as an extremely cunning man, observed Amnon's deteriorating condition and questioned him about why the king's son appeared so worn out morning after morning. Amnon made his confession. "I have feelings for Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom." Jonadab constructed a malicious scheme. He instructed Amnon to act as though he were ill, and when David came to visit him, to ask that Tamar come and make food in his presence so that he could consume it from her hand. Amnon implemented this wicked counsel. When David came to see him, Amnon presented his request, and the king, not suspecting any deception, sent instructions to Tamar. "Travel to your brother Amnon's residence and make food for him." Tamar followed her father's command. She traveled to Amnon's living quarters and started making bread while he observed from where he lay. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verses 8 and 9 describe how she took dough and worked it and formed cakes while he watched and cooked the cakes, and she lifted the pan and poured it out in front of him, but he declined to eat. Then Amnon issued a command that exposed his actual intentions. He commanded everyone else to exit the room. When they were by themselves, verse 11 says, he grabbed hold of her and spoke to her, "Come and be with me, my sister." Tamar responded with horror. She replied to him in verse 12, "No, my brother, do not force yourself on me, because such an action is not performed in Israel. Do not commit this terrible act." She pleaded with him to cease, attempting to appeal to his reason. She even proposed in verse 13 that he speak with the king, stating, "He will not keep me from you," trying anything to stop what was about to occur. But Amnon refused to listen. Verse 14 records the horrific moment, but he refused to hear her. And possessing greater strength than she had, he forced himself on her and violated her. In that instant, Tamar's existence was shattered. Her prospects, her dignity, her honor, all taken by a man who claimed to be her brother. Then something even more disturbing occurred. Verse 15 states, "Then Amnon despised her with extremely intense hatred, so that the hatred he felt toward her exceeded the love he had claimed to feel for her. The fixation that had made him ill transformed immediately into revulsion. He summoned his servant and declared in verse 17, 'Remove this woman from my sight and secure the door behind her.' Tamar departed from Amnon's residence, wearing the long robe with sleeves that identified her as a virgin princess, a garment she would never properly wear again. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19 informs us that Tamar placed ashes upon her head and ripped the long robe she was wearing, and she put her hand upon her head and walked away, weeping loudly as she traveled. She moved through the palace area in open disgrace, her cries making everyone aware of what had been done to her. Absalom discovered his sister in this devastated condition. The scriptures in 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 20 record his initial words to her. "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" He already possessed the answer before she could speak. The torn garment, the ashes, the weeping, everything revealed the story. Absalom's reaction appeared carefully measured, but contained multiple layers of significance. He told Tamar, "Now remain silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not allow this matter to consume your heart." Some people might hear these statements and assume Absalom was minimizing his sister's suffering, but they would be mistaken. He was instructing her to stay quiet for the present moment, not permanently. He was telling her not to let this completely destroy her because he was forming plans. The statement, "He is your brother," was not making excuses for Amnon's violation. It was Absalom, recognizing the complicated nature of what must follow. This was not simply any violator. This was the king's firstborn son, the one who would inherit the throne, their own half-brother. Any action taken would disturb the entire royal family. The verse goes on to say, "So Tamar remained, a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's household. He brought her into his home, provided her with shelter, offered her protection." But the word desolate reveals everything about Tamar's state. She was destroyed in society's perception, unable to marry, shattered. And every single day that Absalom observed his sister existing in this state, his fury intensified. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 22, provides us with an essential insight into Absalom's nature. But Absalom said to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom despised Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Notice what the text does not indicate. It does not indicate Absalom confronted Amnon. It does not state he raised his voice or made threats or created a disturbance. Rather, Absalom said to Amnon, neither good nor bad. He uttered nothing whatsoever. This silence carried more danger than any verbal threat could. Absalom was not a person of rash fury. He was calculating, methodical, willing to wait. While others might have erupted in immediate rage and pursued instant vengeance, Absalom maintained complete self-control. He observed Amnon moving without restriction through the palace. He witnessed his half-brother laughing and dining and resting peacefully, facing no punishment for his crime. And with every day that passed, Absalom's hatred intensified, fed by his sister's continuous suffering and his father's failure to act. The handsome prince with the perfect physical appearance was learning to present a false face. Outwardly, he preserved his calm demeanor, his royal dignity, but internally, a strategy was taking shape, a strategy that would demand patience, proper timing, and the ideal moment. Absalom was prepared to wait because he comprehended that vengeance delivered cold proved more powerful than heated fury. He would provide Amnon with no advance warning, no opportunity to make preparations or mount a defense. When the time arrived, it would be quick and conclusive. When the report of Tamar's rape arrived at King David, his response should have been swift and harsh. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 21 informs us plainly that when King David received word of all these events, he became extremely angry. The Hebrew term employed here communicates burning fury, powerful rage. David felt furious about what his firstborn son had committed. But that is where the verse concludes. David experienced anger, and then he took no action. No discipline was commanded, no justice was administered, no repercussion came to Amnon for violating his sister. The one who would inherit Israel's throne had perpetrated a horrible crime, and the king who was responsible for upholding God's law stayed silent. Why? The scriptures do not directly tell us David's thought process, but we can grasp it from what we understand about his history. David himself had engaged in adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah. The prophet Nathan had confronted him, and God had granted David forgiveness. But the prophet had also proclaimed that the sword would remain in David's household forever because of his transgression. Perhaps David believed he lacked the moral standing to pass judgment on his son when he himself had done something even more terrible. Perhaps his sense of guilt immobilized him. Or perhaps it was more straightforward than that. Amnon was David's firstborn child, his successor, the son who would take the throne. To discipline Amnon harshly, to have him executed as the law required for such a violation, would mean eliminating his heir. David cared deeply for his sons, even when they committed evil acts. His love weakened him when he needed to demonstrate strength. But David's failure to act communicated a distinct message throughout the royal family. It informed everyone that if you were among the king's favorites, if you held sufficient importance, if David cared for you enough, you could escape consequences for anything. Even the most horrific violations could remain unpunished. It informed Tamar that her pain held less value than preserving Amnon's status. It informed all the other sons that their father's justice was not impartial. It showed favoritism. And it informed Absalom that if he desired justice for his sister, he would need to obtain it himself. David's silence was not merely a failure to take action. It was a choice that set all subsequent events into motion. Every day that went by, without Amnon experiencing consequences, represented another day that the kingdom's reverence for David's leadership diminished. Every day represented another day that Absalom's disrespect for his father expanded. The king who had slain Goliath, who had conquered the Philistines, who had built Israel's throne, this identical king found himself unable to discipline his own child. In Absalom's perception, his father had ceased to be the powerful king of stories, He had become a feeble, elderly man who allowed his feelings to dictate his choices, who showed partiality, who failed to maintain the very laws he was meant to enforce. This understanding altered something fundamental in Absalom's perception of his father and of the throne itself. Absalom did not take action right away. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 23 begins with these statements. After 2 complete years had passed, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is located near Ephraim. 2 complete years elapsed between Tamar's violation and Absalom's revenge. For 24 months, Absalom preserved his silence in Amnon's presence. For 2 years, he observed and waited and strategized. This patience was extraordinary. Most men would have acted in the intensity of anger within days or weeks following the crime. But not Absalom. He grasped that time worked in his favor. The more time that passed, the more Amnon would become comfortable, the more everyone would begin to think that perhaps Absalom had come to terms with what occurred, that perhaps he had let it go. 2 years provided enough time for people to reduce their vigilance, to cease being watchful, to believe the threat had disappeared. When Absalom at last took action, he selected his timing flawlessly. The sheep shearing season was a time of festivity in ancient Israel, similar to harvest celebrations. It was a period when labor was finished and people assembled to celebrate and drink and appreciate the results of their work. Absalom extended invitations to all the king's sons to accompany him to Baal Hazor for this celebration. On the surface, it appeared like an olive branch, an action of family togetherness, an indication that Absalom desired to unite the royal brothers in companionship. But Absalom had an additional request. Verse 24 states, "And Absalom approached the king and said, 'Look, your servant has sheep shearers. Please allow the king and his servants to accompany your servant.'" He extended an invitation to David himself to be present. This was intelligent for 2 reasons. First, it made the invitation appear harmless. If he was inviting the king, surely his intentions were good. Second, Absalom probably understood his father would refuse, and David did refuse. Verse 25 captures his reply. But the king told Absalom, "No, my son, we should not all travel in case we become a burden to you." David recognized that the king traveling with his complete entourage would be costly for Absalom to accommodate. He urged Absalom, but Absalom continued pressing. Then came Absalom's genuine request mentioned in verse 26. Then Absalom stated, "If not, please allow my brother Amnon to accompany us." This was the favor Absalom had desired from the beginning, Amnon specifically. David's reply is revealing. And the king questioned him, "Why should he accompany you?" Even David detected something unusual about this particular request, but Absalom pressed him persistently. And ultimately, verse 27 states, David sent along with him Amnon and all the king's sons. Now Absalom possessed what he required. Amnon would be distant from Jerusalem, distant from the palace guards, distant from his father's security. He would be at Absalom's celebration, encircled by Absalom's servants, consuming Absalom's wine. And Absalom had already provided his servants with their directions, recorded in verse 28. Then Absalom gave orders to his servants. Pay attention, when Amnon's mood is cheerful with wine, and when I tell you, strike Amnon, then end his life. Do not be afraid. Have I not given you this command? Be bold and be strong. The strategy was established. Absalom would wait until Amnon was intoxicated, his reactions dulled, his thinking compromised. Then, at Absalom's indication, his servants would attack. Absalom reassured them they would face no blame. He was accepting complete responsibility through his command. He was directing them as their prince, and he urged them to demonstrate courage and valor, using words that mirrored military instructions, approaching this killing as a conflict to be victorious in. The celebration at Baal Hazor commenced like any festivity. Wine poured abundantly, food was plentiful, and the king's sons became comfortable amid the festivities. Amnon, the one who would inherit the throne, had no cause to anticipate danger. 2 years had elapsed since Tamar's assault. If Absalom had desired revenge, surely he would have pursued it before now. Amnon consumed wine heavily, his defenses entirely lowered. Then, precisely as Absalom had strategized, when Amnon's mood was elevated with wine, the instant arrived. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 29 describes what transpired next. So the servants of Absalom acted toward Amnon as Absalom had directed. At Absalom's indication, his servants attacked Amnon. The firstborn son of King David, the one who would inherit Israel's throne, was murdered at a celebration by his own brother's men. The verse proceeds with the immediate consequences. Then all the king's sons stood up, and each climbed onto his mule and escaped. Terror broke out among the princes. If Absalom had murdered Amnon, were they next in line? Was this the start of a widespread slaughter? They refused to wait to discover the answer. Each brother seized his mule, the typical mode of transport for royalty in those times, and ran in various directions, racing back toward Jerusalem and safety. Meanwhile, a messenger arrived at David with crushing news, but the information was incorrect. Verse 30 states, while they were traveling, reports reached David. Absalom has murdered all the king's sons, and not a single one of them remains alive. Someone had witnessed the disorder, seen princes running in all directions, and concluded the worst. They rushed ahead to inform the king that all his sons had perished. The following verse captures David's reaction to this terrible news. Then the king stood up and ripped his garments and collapsed on the ground, and all his servants who were present ripped their garments. David physically collapsed to the ground in sorrow. He tore his royal clothing, an expression of the most profound mourning. His servants did the same, participating with their king in his distress. For a brief time, David thought he had lost all his sons in one day. But then Jonadab interjected, the identical Jonadab who had assisted Amnon in devising the scheme to rape Tamar initially. Verse 32 captures his statements. Let not my lord believe that they have murdered all the young men, the king's sons, because Amnon by himself is deceased. For by the instruction of Absalom, this has been decided from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Jonadab disclosed that he had understood all along that Absalom planned revenge. He assured David that solely Amnon had died. Verse 34 verifies this. But Absalom escaped. And the young man who maintained the watch raised up his eyes and observed, and look, many people were approaching from the road behind him along the side of the mountain. The watchers could observe the other princes nearing Jerusalem, living and unharmed. And verse 37 discloses what transpired with Absalom. But Absalom escaped and traveled to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David grieved for his son continuously. Absalom had fled to his grandfather's kingdom, to his mother's father, understanding he would discover safety there. He could not remain in Israel after ending the king's firstborn child's life. But notice the closing line. David grieved for his son. Which son? The verse is intentionally unclear. Was David mourning for Amnon, who had died, or was he mourning for Absalom, who had become a fugitive? Perhaps both. David had lost 2 sons that day, one to death, one to banishment. 2 Samuel, chapter 13, verse 38, informs us what occurred subsequently. So Absalom escaped and traveled to Geshur and remained there 3 years. 3 complete years Absalom spent distant from Jerusalem, distant from Israel, residing in his grandfather's kingdom. He had obtained vengeance for his sister, but the price was exile from everything he recognized, from his residence, from his father, from his prospects. During these 3 years, something significant was occurring in David's emotions. Verse 39 discloses this. And the spirit of the king desired to reach out to Absalom because he was finding comfort about Amnon since he was deceased. As time moved forward and David's sorrow over Amnon's death lessened, his thoughts shifted increasingly to his living son. David started to yearn for Absalom, to desire he could see him once more, to want reconciliation. But David took no action about these emotions. He made no attempt to bring Absalom back. He dispatched no messengers, declared no pardon, offered no invitation. David yearned for his son, but stayed immobilized by his own feelings and perhaps by his understanding of what was proper. Amnon had raped Tamar without facing punishment. Absalom had murdered Amnon as revenge. How could the king simply pardon that? Yet how could a father keep rejecting his own son when his heart longed for him? So David did nothing, and Absalom stayed in Geshur, aware his father yearned for him but would not summon him home. We can only contemplate what those 3 years accomplished to Absalom's thinking. He had abundant time to reflect on his father's pattern of inaction. David had failed to discipline Amnon for 2 years. Now David was failing to bring back Absalom for 3 years. The king appeared unable to make difficult choices when it involved his sons. Absalom likely pondered all his father's shortcomings during this banishment. David's previous transgressions with Bathsheba and Uriah were widely known. His inability to discipline his children was becoming notorious. His emotional character made him susceptible to control. These 3 years in Geshur were not merely exile for Absalom, they were a period of change. The prince who had departed Jerusalem, pursuing justice for his sister, was transforming into someone different, someone more hardened, someone with greater ambitions than simple revenge. Joab, David's nephew and military leader, understood that the circumstances could not persist indefinitely. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 1 states, "Now Joab the son of Zeruiah understood that the king's emotions went out to Absalom. Joab observed David's yearning and chose to manipulate the king into taking action." Joab's strategy was complex. He obtained a wise woman from Tekoa and instructed her to act as though she were mourning. He provided her with a narrative to present to the king, a parable really. The woman appeared before David and informed him she was a widow with 2 sons. Her sons had fought in a field where nobody could stop them, and one ended the other's life. Now her entire clan was insisting that she surrender her surviving son to be put to death for his brother's murder. If she complied with this, she would possess no sons remaining, nobody to preserve her family legacy. David's reaction, recorded in verse 11, was swift. "As the Lord exists, not a single hair of your son will fall to the earth." He vowed to safeguard her remaining son. Then the woman exposed the trap in verse 13. "Why then have you devised such a thing against the people of God? For in providing this judgment, the king finds himself guilty inasmuch as the king does not bring his exiled one back again." She was highlighting David's inconsistency. He would demonstrate mercy to a stranger's son who perpetrated murder, but not to his own son. David understood he had been controlled. And when he questioned who arranged her to do this, she confessed in verse 19 that Joab, your servant, instructed me. It was he who placed all these statements in the mouth of your servant. David summoned Joab and at last issued the command everyone had been anticipating. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 21 records it. "Look now, I have approved this. Go retrieve the young man Absalom." After 3 years, David was permitting his son to come back. But there was a crushing condition. Verse 24 provides David's complete directions. "And the king stated, 'Let him stay separate in his own residence. He is not to enter my presence.' So Absalom resided separate in his own residence and did not enter the king's presence. Absalom was permitted to come back to Jerusalem, but he was barred from observing his father's face. He was home but not home, brought back but not brought back. He could reside in the city of his origin, move through its streets, observe its inhabitants, but he could not step into the palace, could not communicate with his father, could not be genuinely reconciled. This incomplete restoration might have been more painful than banishment, because every day Absalom existed with the reminder that David continued to reject him. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 28 informs us how long this agonizing circumstance continued. So Absalom resided 2 years in Jerusalem without entering the king's presence, 2 additional years. First 2 years observing Amnon remain unpunished, then 3 years in banishment, now 2 additional years residing in Jerusalem but prohibited from his father's presence. 7 years in total of different forms of rejection and separation. These 7 years had transformed Absalom entirely. The prince, who once pursued only justice for his sister, had absorbed difficult lessons about authority, about weakness, about how kingdoms genuinely function. He had discovered that David could be controlled, that the king's feelings made him vulnerable, that justice in Israel was not impartial but favored whoever David cherished most at any given time. And perhaps most significantly, Absalom had started to perceive himself not as David's son pursuing restoration, but as someone who could serve as a superior king than his father. After 2 years of residing in Jerusalem without observing his father's face, Absalom's patience expired. He required to terminate this incomplete exile, this halfway discipline that left him suspended between acceptance and rejection. So Absalom chose to compel a meeting with David, but he required assistance. The person who could facilitate this was Joab, the commander who had transported him back from Geshur initially. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 29, informs us what Absalom accomplished. Then Absalom summoned Joab to dispatch him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him, and he summoned a second time, but Joab refused to come. Absalom called for Joab once, and the commander disregarded him. He summoned him again, and Joab still declined to appear. Perhaps Joab was occupied with military responsibilities. Perhaps he believed he had already accomplished sufficient by transporting Absalom back. Perhaps he sensed that becoming involved further would be risky. Whatever the explanation, Joab would not answer Absalom's summons. So Absalom selected a striking way to capture Joab's focus. Verse 30 records his instruction. Then he told his servants, "Observe, Joab's field is adjacent to mine, and he possesses barley there. Go and ignite it on fire." So Absalom's servants ignited the field. Absalom directed his men to burn Joab's barley field, which was beside his own land. This was not a minor action. Barley held value, and destroying someone's harvest was a grave offense. But Absalom understood it would succeed, and it accomplished that. Verse 31 states, "Then Joab stood up and traveled to Absalom at his residence and questioned him, 'Why have your servants ignited my field?' Joab arrived right away, insisting to understand why Absalom had destroyed his property. Now Absalom possessed the commander's complete focus, and he communicated directly about his disappointment. Verse 32 provides us Absalom's reply. Absalom responded to Joab, "Look, I dispatched word to you. Arrive here that I may dispatch you to the king to inquire, 'Why have I traveled from Geshur? It would be superior for me to be there still. Now, therefore, allow me to enter into the presence of the king, and if there is wrongdoing in me, allow him to execute me.'" Absalom's statements addressed the core of the difficulty. What was the purpose of transporting him back from Geshur if he could not observe his father? This halfway restoration proved more painful than banishment. At minimum in Geshur, Absalom possessed dignity. Here in Jerusalem, he was a prince in dishonor, residing in his own residence but barred from the palace like a lawbreaker. Absalom instructed Joab to deliver a message to the king. "Either provide me complete restoration or put me to death." This suspended condition was intolerable. If David genuinely thought Absalom was guilty and merited discipline, then allow him to implement justice. But if David had pardoned him, then why this persistent separation? Joab traveled to David and conveyed Absalom's message. The king, who had yearned for his son for years, at last consented to observe him. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 33 describes the instant of reunion. So Joab traveled to the king and informed him, and he called for Absalom. So he approached the king and prostrated himself with his face to the earth before the king, and the king embraced Absalom. After 5 years of separation, 3 years in Geshur and 2 years in Jerusalem, father and son at last stood facing one another. Absalom appeared before David and prostrated with his face to the earth, the customary posture of total submission before the king. This was the appropriate way to approach royalty, demonstrating respect and recognizing authority. Absalom was not approaching as an equal, but as a subject, as a son pursuing his father's favor. And David embraced him. In ancient Middle Eastern tradition, this embrace was meaningful. It was an expression of acceptance, of peace, of renewed relationship. When a father embraced his son after a lengthy separation, it signified forgiveness. It signified the history was behind them. It signified they could proceed forward together. The embrace should have repaired everything, but something was damaged that could not be mended with an embrace. 5 years was an extensive time, too extensive. During those years, too much had transpired. Tamar still resided as a desolate woman in Absalom's residence, still experiencing the consequences of what Amnon had committed and from David's failure to discipline it. Absalom had ended his brother's life and existed in banishment, then returned to a city where he was present but separated. The embrace was a gesture, but gestures cannot reverse years of suffering and rejection. Absalom had discovered things during those 5 years that transformed him permanently. He had discovered that David's care was conditional, that the king demonstrated favoritism, that justice in Israel relied on who you were rather than what you had committed. He had discovered that his father could be controlled, first by Jonadab, who assisted Amnon, then by Joab, who transported Absalom back, then by Absalom himself, who compelled this meeting by burning Joab's field. The reconciliation was ceremonial but hollow. David embraced Absalom, but trust was not renewed, care was not revived, the relationship was not repaired. Absalom rose from that embrace, still handsome, still captivating, still intelligent, but fundamentally altered. He had approached pursuing his father's acceptance. What he discovered instead was verification that David was weak, that the throne of Israel was held by a man whose feelings dictated his choices. After his reconciliation with David, Absalom was unrestricted to travel throughout Jerusalem without limitation. He could step into the palace, take part in royal activities, and be observed by the people as a prince of Israel once more. But Absalom did not resume his previous existence. Instead, he started to present himself in a completely different way. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 1 informs us what Absalom accomplished next. After this, Absalom obtained himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to dash before him. This was a striking departure from custom in Israel. David himself, despite holding the position of king, preserved a comparatively modest lifestyle compared to the monarchs of neighboring nations. He did not parade through the streets with magnificent displays of prosperity and authority. But Absalom selected differently. He obtained a chariot, a vehicle connected with royalty and military power. Chariots were costly, distinguished, and remarkable to observe. He also acquired horses to draw this chariot, which was another indication of prosperity and position. But most striking of all, he employed 50 men whose sole responsibility was to dash in front of his chariot whenever he moved through the city. Picture the spectacle. Absalom, with his flawless appearance and his spectacular hair, traveling through Jerusalem in a royal chariot, 50 powerful men dashing ahead of him, proclaiming his approach, clearing the path, ensuring everyone paused and observed. This was performance, a deliberately constructed spectacle intended to impress the common people and establish an idea in their thoughts. This man resembles a king. This man conducts himself like a king. No other prince in Israel moved this way. Absalom was intentionally distinguishing himself, raising himself above his brothers, presenting himself as more than simply one of David's numerous sons. He was making a declaration with every public appearance. The chariot declared, "I possess power." The horses declared, "I possess wealth." The 50 runners declared, "I possess sufficient importance to command men." But this presentation was not simply about demonstrating status. It was the start of a political movement, though nobody identified it as such at the time. Absalom was constructing a public impression, generating an effect, making people connect him with royal power and authority. He desired the citizens of Jerusalem and visitors from throughout Israel's tribes to observe him and think of kingship. But Absalom's movement was not solely about presentations. He possessed a more direct and personal approach for obtaining the people's devotion. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 2, describes his daily pattern. And Absalom would rise early and position beside the path of the gate. And when any man possessed a disagreement to present before the king for verdict, Absalom would summon to him and inquire, "From what city are you?" And when he stated, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel," Absalom stationed himself at the city gate each morning. In ancient Israel, the gate was not simply an opening to the city, it was the hub of public existence. This was where commerce was transacted, where legal disagreements were addressed, where people assembled to converse and share information. It was the location where you traveled if you required to present a case before the king for judgment. And Absalom ensured he was there before anyone else, intercepting people before they could arrive at David. His method was personal and cordial. When someone approached with a legal grievance, Absalom would call out to them, inquire what city they originated from, engage them in discussion. He was not aloof or ceremonial like most royalty. He approached these common people like they held significance, like their difficulties were significant to him personally. He discovered their identities, their towns, their tribes. He made them feel observed and acknowledged. Then came the essential part of his approach, recorded in verse 3. Absalom would tell him, "Observe, your assertions are valid and correct, but there is nobody appointed by the king to address you." This was masterful control. Absalom would listen to someone's legal disagreement and right away confirm them. He would inform them, "You're completely correct. Your case is powerful. You merit justice." But then Absalom would establish doubt about David's government. He would propose that the king had failed to adequately organize the legal structure. He would suggest that David had not designated sufficient judges throughout the kingdom, that people had to journey all the way to Jerusalem for justice. He was not directly criticizing David, but he was subtly diminishing confidence in the king's leadership. And then came the concluding stroke, also in verse 3. Then Absalom would state, "Oh, that I would serve as judge in the land. Then every man with a disagreement or situation might approach me, and I would provide him justice." After making people question David's structure, Absalom presented himself as the answer. If only he were responsible, if only he possessed the power, then everyone would obtain justice. Absalom's approach extended beyond statements. He comprehended that people react not simply to what you state, but to how you make them experience. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 5 describes another essential element of his method. And whenever a man approached near to demonstrate respect to him, he would extend his hand and grasp hold of him and embrace him. When someone neared Absalom at the gate, they would naturally bow or demonstrate respect because he was a prince. This was appropriate procedure, but Absalom would not permit it. Instead, he would extend his hand, draw the person upward or toward him, and embrace them. This physical action dismantled the normal divisions between royalty and common people. It communicated, "I am not superior to you. I am one of you. We are the same." This was manufactured modesty, but it was tremendously powerful. People were not accustomed to being approached this way by royalty. They anticipated distance, ceremony, social structure. But here was a prince, the most handsome man in all Israel, traveling in a chariot with 50 runners, who would extend and embrace them like a companion. It generated a powerful emotional bond. People experienced special. They experienced appreciated. They experienced like Absalom sincerely cared about them as people. And Absalom accomplished this reliably. Verse 5 states, "Whenever a man approached near, he would accomplish this, not occasionally, not exclusively to significant people, to everyone, wealthy or impoverished, from powerful tribes or small towns. Every person who neared Absalom obtained this identical treatment. He made each one experience significant, acknowledged, and appreciated." The outcome of this extended movement is recorded in verse 6. Thus, Absalom accomplished to all of Israel who approached to the king for verdict. So Absalom captured the devotion of the men of Israel. Notice that term, captured. The devotion was not willingly provided, it was obtained through manipulation. Absalom was executing a deception, controlling people's feelings, constructing devotion through dishonest intentions. But the people possessed no awareness of this. They thought Absalom's performance was sincere. They differentiated him with David, the elderly king who remained in his palace, while this youthful, vigorous prince positioned at the gate each morning, acknowledging their difficulties, confirming their worries, guaranteeing justice. In their thoughts, Absalom resembled the future. After years of this meticulous political labor, Absalom was prepared to execute his action. But he required to accomplish it distant from Jerusalem, distant from David's direct control, in a location where he could assemble his followers and present his assertion to the throne. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 7 informs us his strategy. And at the conclusion of 4 years, Absalom told the king, "Please allow me to travel and fulfill my promise, which I have promised to the Lord in Hebron." 4 years. That is the duration Absalom had been laboring at the gate, constructing his foundation of backing, capturing the devotion of Israel. Now the instant had arrived, but he could not simply proclaim himself king in Jerusalem. He required to depart the city first, to assemble his forces, to generate momentum. So he approached David with a religious justification. Absalom informed his father that he had made a promise to the Lord and required to travel to Hebron to complete it. Verse 8 provides the explanation he presented. "For your servant promised a promise while I resided at Geshur in Aram, stating, 'If the Lord will truly transport me back to Jerusalem, then I will present worship to the Lord.'" He asserted that during his 3 years of banishment in Geshur, he had vowed to God that if he ever came back to Israel, he would travel to Hebron to worship and complete his promise. This sounded plausible. Hebron was a meaningful city in Israel's narrative. It was where Abraham had resided and where he was interred. It was the location where David himself had initially been crowned king over Judah before he became king over all Israel. David harbored no suspicion. Verse 9 records his reply, "And the king told him, 'Travel in peace.' So he stood up and traveled to Hebron. David provided his approval and permitted Absalom to depart. The king possessed no awareness he was dispatching his son to initiate a revolt. But Absalom was deceiving. There was no promise, or if there was a promise, it was not the genuine explanation for this journey. Absalom had selected Hebron intentionally for tactical reasons. First, it was David's initial capital, which provided Absalom's assertion historical validity. Second, it was sufficiently distant from Jerusalem to provide Absalom time to organize before David could answer. Absalom did not travel to Hebron by himself. Verse 11 informs us, "With Absalom traveled 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited companions, and they traveled in their innocence and possessed no awareness." Absalom transported 200 men from Jerusalem with him, but these men possessed no understanding of what was genuinely occurring. They thought they were traveling to a religious ceremony. Once Absalom arrived at Hebron, he activated the plot he had been constructing for years. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 10 discloses the indication he had organized. But Absalom dispatched secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, declaring, "As soon as you perceive the sound of the trumpet, then declare, 'Absalom is king at Hebron.'" This verse demonstrates us how meticulously Absalom had strategized this revolt. He had not simply been obtaining devotion in Jerusalem. He had been dispatching secret messengers throughout all 12 tribes of Israel, constructing a system of followers in every area. These were people who had encountered him at the gate, who had been captivated by his chariot and his worry for justice, who thought he would serve as a superior king than David. Absalom had provided them all the identical direction: wait for the sound of the trumpet, then proclaim that Absalom is king. The trumpet was a masterful indication. In ancient Israel, trumpets proclaimed significant occasions: the start of celebrations, the summoning of gatherings, the coronation of kings. When people throughout Israel perceived trumpets blowing in their towns and cities, they would understand something meaningful was transpiring, and Absalom's followers would right away start proclaiming him king. generating a surge of proclamation that would sweep across the nation at the same time. This was not a spontaneous rebellion. This was a planned nationwide attempt at seizing power. Absalom possessed followers positioned in every tribe, waiting for his indication, prepared to take action the instant they perceived that trumpet. The revolt would not be concentrated in simply one city. It would emerge everywhere simultaneously. But Absalom had also secured himself an essential supporter. Verse 12 informs us, "And while Absalom was presenting the offerings, he dispatched for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's advisor from his city Gilo." Ahithophel was not simply any follower. He was David's personal advisor, one of the king's most relied upon counselors, the man who had assisted David make choices, who understood the king's tactics and vulnerabilities. This man had abandoned the king. The verse proceeds, "And the plot intensified in strength, and the people with Absalom continued multiplying." As soon as the revolt was proclaimed openly, people rushed to Absalom's position. The momentum was entirely with Absalom. The information arrived at Jerusalem like a lightning strike. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 13, records the instant David discovered what was transpiring. And a messenger approached David, declaring, "The devotion of the men of Israel have transferred after Absalom." With those statements, David's world shattered. His son had not traveled to Hebron to worship. He had traveled there to capture the throne. David's reaction was swift and startling. Verse 14 provides his instruction. "Then David told all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, 'Stand up and let us escape, or else there will be no departure for us from Absalom. Travel swiftly, in case he overtakes us swiftly and brings down destruction on us and attacks the city with the blade of the sword.'" David, the warrior king who had conquered Goliath, who had defeated the Philistines, this identical David selected to flee. He did not attempt to assemble the army. He did not arrange Jerusalem's protections. Instead, he commanded swift evacuation. The messenger had informed him that the devotion of the men of Israel had transferred after Absalom. David comprehended what this signified. His son had effectively turned the nation against him. Verse 15 demonstrates that David's servants stayed devoted, and the king's servants told the king, "Look, your servants are prepared to accomplish whatever my lord the king chooses." They were with him, whatever he selected. So the evacuation started. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 16 describes the departure. "So the king departed, and all his household after him, and the king abandoned 10 concubines to maintain the residence. David moved out of his palace, surrendering the city where he had ruled for years. His entire household accompanied him, his wives, his children, his servants, but he abandoned 10 of his concubines behind to preserve the palace." Verse 17 proceeds, "And the king departed, and all the people after him, and they paused at the final residence." David and his devoted followers departed Jerusalem and paused at the boundary of the city, at the final residence before open territory. There, David paused to observe who would accompany him. Verse 18 states, "And all his servants proceeded by him, and all the Cherethites and all the Pelethites and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath proceeded on before the king." David's personal protectors, his foreign soldiers, his veteran warriors, these men remained with him. They proceeded by him in arrangement, demonstrating their persistent devotion even as the nation turned to Absalom. This was David's most difficult hour. His own son had captured his throne. The people he had governed had deserted him. He was escaping his capital city, not understanding where he would travel or how this would conclude. When Absalom stepped into Jerusalem after David had escaped, he required to accomplish something that would make it unattainable for him to ever reconcile with his father. He required to destroy every connection, to make a public declaration so offensive that there could be no reversing. So Absalom turned to Ahithophel for guidance on how to solidify his status. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 20 informs us what transpired. Then Absalom told Ahithophel, "Provide your guidance. What shall we accomplish?" Absalom was requesting his counselor for tactical direction on how to strengthen his assertion to the throne. Verse 21 records Ahithophel's guidance. Ahithophel told Absalom, "Be with your father's concubines, whom he has abandoned to maintain the residence, and all Israel will perceive that you have made yourself offensive to your father, and the resolve of all who are with you will be fortified." This was not simply political guidance. It was an intentional act of ultimate disrespect. By claiming his father's concubines, Absalom would be asserting ownership of everything that belonged to David. In ancient tradition, claiming a king's wives signified asserting his throne. The strategy possessed two objectives. First, it would fortify Absalom's followers by demonstrating them there could be no reconciliation with David. Second, it would openly proclaim Absalom as the new king. Verse 22 describes what transpired next. So they erected a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom was with his father's concubines in the observation of all Israel. They established a tent on the palace roof, the identical roof where David had once moved and observed Bathsheba bathing. Now on that identical roof, Absalom perpetrated this public act of revolt. The phrase "in the observation of all Israel" is significant. This was not accomplished secretly. This was a public demonstration intended to be observed and understood by everyone. Absalom desired all of Israel to witness this act, to comprehend that he had totally rejected his father. This completed a prophecy that Nathan had communicated to David years earlier. When David had transgressed with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah, the prophet informed him in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, "Thus declares the Lord, Look, I will generate evil against you out of your own household, and I will claim your wives before your perception and provide them to your neighbor, and he shall be with your wives in the observation of this sun." What Absalom accomplished on that rooftop was the completion of God's verdict on David's previous transgressions. After solidifying his status through this disgraceful act, Absalom required to determine his subsequent action. David had escaped Jerusalem, but he was still living and still possessed devoted followers. Ahithophel understood that the solution to succeeding in this revolt was to take action swiftly and conclusively. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 1 records Ahithophel's military approach. Moreover, Ahithophel told Absalom, "Allow me to select 12,000 men, and I will stand up and chase David tonight." Ahithophel desired to advance right away. He requested permission to choose 12,000 soldiers and pursue after David that very night. Verse 2 explains his logic. "I will approach him while he is exhausted and disheartened, and throw him into terror, and all the people who are with him will escape. I will attack only the king." Ahithophel's strategy was masterful in its straightforwardness. David and his followers had recently escaped Jerusalem. They would be fatigued, emotionally depleted, and not anticipating a swift assault. A surprise strike at night would generate disorder and panic. The essential phrase is, "I will attack only the king." Ahithophel was not suggesting a widespread killing. He desired to end David's life and David's life alone. This would terminate the dispute right away. Without David, there would be no competing assertion to the throne. Verse 3 proceeds with Ahithophel's reasoning, "And I will transport all the people back to you, as a bride approaches home to her husband. You pursue the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." Ahithophel guaranteed that ending David's life would bring together the nation under Absalom's governance. There would be peace, because the dispute would be settled swiftly with minimal loss of life. The closing statement of verse 3 states, "So the guidance appeared correct to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel." Everyone consented this was a solid strategy. Absalom favored it. His counselors endorsed it. If this strategy had been implemented, David would probably have been ended that night, and Absalom would have solidified his throne permanently. Before Ahithophel's strategy could be implemented, another voice interjected. Hushai, the Archite, had been David's companion and counselor, but when David escaped Jerusalem, he dispatched Hushai back to the city with particular directions. David instructed Hushai to act as though he supported Absalom and to oppose Ahithophel's guidance whenever feasible. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 5 informs us, "Then Absalom stated, 'Summon Hushai the Archite also, and let us perceive what he has to declare.'" Before confirming the choice to implement Ahithophel's strategy, Absalom chose to obtain a second perspective. Verse 6 records what transpired. "And when Hushai approached to Absalom, Absalom told him, 'Thus has Ahithophel communicated. Shall we accomplish as he declares? If not, you communicate.'" Absalom explained Ahithophel's strategy to Hushai and questioned if they should implement it. Hushai understood he had to discredit Ahithophel's strategy. Verse 7 states, "Then Hushai told Absalom, 'This time the guidance that Ahithophel has provided is not sound.'" This was a daring declaration. Ahithophel was recognized for his intelligence. Verse 8 records his logic. Hushai stated, "You understand that your father and his men are powerful men, and that they are furious like a bear deprived of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is skilled in conflict. He will not remain the night with the people." Hushai painted a picture of David as a dangerous, skilled warrior. He compared them to a mother bear, whose cubs had been claimed the most dangerous animal you could face. Verse 9 proceeds, "Look, even now he has concealed himself in one of the pits or in some other location. And as soon as some of the people collapse at the initial strike, whoever perceives it will declare, 'There has been a killing among the people who accompany Absalom.'" Hushai proposed that David would establish a trap. Then Hushai appealed to panic. Verse 10 states, "Then even the courageous man whose emotions is like the emotions of a lion will completely dissolve with panic. For all Israel understands that your father is a powerful man, and that those who are with him are courageous men." Even courageous soldiers would lose bravery if they perceived that David was resisting effectively. After dismantling Ahithophel's strategy, Hushai presented his own approach in verse 11. "But my guidance is that all Israel be assembled to you from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for quantity, and that you travel to conflict in person." Instead of a swift attack with 12,000 men, Hushai proposed assembling all of Israel's fighting men. Verse 12 proceeds, "So we shall approach him in some location where he is to be discovered, and we shall descend upon him as the dew descends on the ground, and of him and all the men with him, not one will be remaining." Hushai guaranteed complete triumph. The outcome is recorded in verse 14. "And Absalom and all the men of Israel stated, 'The guidance of Hushai the Archite is superior than the guidance of Ahithophel.' For the Lord had determined to overcome the sound guidance of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might transport harm upon Absalom. Absalom selected Hushai's strategy. The scripture makes it evident this was not simply human choice-making. God was laboring to overcome Ahithophel's guidance. The postponement caused by Hushai's guidance provided David essential time. He crossed the Jordan River, assembled his forces, and arranged his army. Meanwhile, Absalom gathered all the fighting men of Israel and arranged for conflict. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 6, informs us where the conflict occurred. So the army departed into the field against Israel, and the conflict was conducted in the forest of Ephraim. This was not an open plain, where large armies typically conducted conflict. This was a forest dense with trees, challenging terrain. Before the conflict started, David provided particular directions to his commanders. Verse 5 records his instruction. "And the king directed Joab and Abishai and Ittai, 'Treat gently for my benefit with the young man Absalom.' And all the people perceived when the king provided instructions to all the commanders about Absalom. David instructed his 3 top military leaders to treat gently with Absalom. Even though his son had betrayed him, David still cared for him and desired him protected. The conflict itself was crushing for Absalom's forces. Verse 7 describes the result, "And the men of Israel were overcome there by the servants of David, and the killing there was substantial on that day, 20,000 men. 20,000 of Absalom's soldiers perished in that one conflict. But what ended most of these men's lives was not David's soldiers, it was the forest itself." Verse 8 explains, "The conflict spread over the surface of all the territory, and the forest consumed more people that day than the sword." The challenging terrain of the forest ended more men's lives than the actual combat. Soldiers became lost, collapsed into pits, were separated from their units. As the conflict intensified and Absalom's army collapsed around him, the rebel prince attempted to flee. But his attempt to escape resulted in one of the most remarkable deaths recorded in Scripture. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 9 describes what transpired. And Absalom occurred to encounter the servants of David. Absalom was traveling on his mule, and the mule traveled under the dense branches of a substantial oak, and his head became trapped firmly in the oak, and he was hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him traveled on. Absalom was traveling his mule when he traveled under a large oak tree. The branches were dense and positioned low. As he moved underneath, his head became trapped in the tree. Some customs propose it was his renowned hair that became tangled in the branches. Others propose his head simply traveled between branches that closed around his neck. The mule continued traveling, abandoning Absalom hanging from the tree. The phrase, hanging between heaven and earth, is powerful. Absalom was physically hanging in the air, unable to contact the ground, unable to extend upward to release himself. He was trapped between heaven and earth, belonging to neither, captured in total helplessness. This was the identical man who had resembled a king traveling through Jerusalem, the identical prince whose flawless appearance had captured all perception. Now that stunning appearance had transformed into a snare. The very characteristics that had made him distinctive had resulted in his capture. One of David's soldiers observed Absalom hanging there. Verse 10 informs us, and a certain man observed it and informed Joab, "Look, I observed Absalom hanging in an oak." The soldier reported what he had observed to Joab. Joab's reaction, recorded in verse 11, demonstrates his disappointment. Joab told the man who informed him, "What, you observed him? Why then did you not attack him there to the ground? I would have been pleased to provide you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Joab could not comprehend the soldier had not ended Absalom's life when he possessed the opportunity. But the soldier declined, and his explanation is recorded in verse 12. But the man told Joab, "Even if I sensed in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not extend my hand against the king's son. For in our perception, the king directed you and Abishai and Ittai, for my benefit, safeguard the young man Absalom." The soldier reminded Joab that David had openly directed his officers to treat gently with Absalom. Joab possessed no tolerance for this. Verse 14 records his reaction. Joab stated, "I will not waste time like this with you." And he claimed 3 javelins in his hand and drove them into the emotions of Absalom while he was still living in the oak. Joab claimed 3 javelins and drove them into Absalom's emotions while he hung helpless in the tree. This was a direct breach of David's instruction. The king had declared to treat gently with Absalom to protect his life. But Joab made a battlefield choice that David's emotional attachment to his son could not interfere with military requirement. Joab understood that as long as Absalom remained living, he would constitute a threat. Even if captured, Absalom's followers might attempt to release him. From a purely tactical standpoint, Absalom had to perish. So Joab ended him, understanding he was disobeying the king's direct instruction. But Joab did not complete the task by himself. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 15, informs us, "And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, encircled Absalom and attacked him and ended him." After Joab attacked Absalom with the 3 javelins, 10 of Joab's personal soldiers encircled the dying prince and completed ending him. With Absalom's death, the explanation for the conflict terminated. Verse 16 states, "Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops returned back from chasing Israel, for Joab controlled them." Joab right away ceased the combat. But what to accomplish with Absalom's body? Verse 17 describes his interment. "And they claimed Absalom, and threw him into a substantial pit in the forest, and generated over him an extremely substantial heap of stones, and all Israel escaped everyone to his own residence." They threw Absalom's body into a pit and covered it with a pile of stones. This was not a dignified interment. This was the interment of a lawbreaker. David was waiting in the city of Mahanaim for information of the conflict. He did not understand if his army had succeeded or been defeated. And most of all, he did not understand if his son Absalom was living or deceased. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 4 informs us, "Now David was positioned between the two gates. And the watchman traveled up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he raised up his perception and observed, he observed a man dashing alone. A watchman on the wall detected a lone runner nearing." Verse 25 states, "The watchman summoned out and informed the king, and the king stated, 'If he is by himself, there is information in his mouth.' And he approached rapidly and came near." A single runner typically signified information. Ahimaaz arrived first and summoned out in verse 28. Then Ahimaaz declared out to the king, "All is satisfactory." And he prostrated before the king with his face to the earth and stated, "Praised be the Lord your God, who has conveyed up the men who generated their hand against my lord the king." Ahimaaz proclaimed triumph. But David's reaction, recorded in verse 29, demonstrates what he genuinely cared about. And the king stated, "Is it satisfactory with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz replied, "When Joab dispatched the king's servant, your servant, I observed a substantial disturbance, but I do not understand what it was." David did not inquire about the conflict. He inquired only about Absalom. The second messenger arrived. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 31 informs us, "And look, the Cushite approached, and the Cushite stated, 'Favorable information for my lord the king, for the Lord has conveyed you this day from the hand of all who generated up against you.'" But again, David's only inquiry, recorded in verse 32, was about his son. The king told the Cushite, "Is it satisfactory with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite replied, "May the opponents of my lord the king and all who generate up against you for evil be like that young man." The Cushite did not declare directly that Absalom had perished, but David comprehended. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, describes his reaction. "And the king was profoundly affected and traveled up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he traveled, he declared, 'O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have perished instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" David collapsed down entirely. He declared out his son's identity over and over. He desired he had perished in Absalom's position. The triumph signified nothing to him. The narrative of Absalom concludes with a detail that demonstrates the emptiness behind all his desires. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 18 informs us something Absalom had accomplished while he was still living. Now, Absalom, in his lifetime, had claimed and established up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he stated, "I possess no son to maintain my identity in remembrance." He summoned the pillar after his own identity, and it is summoned Absalom's monument to this day. Absalom had constructed a monument to himself during his lifetime. He erected a pillar in the king's valley near Jerusalem. He explained why. "I possess no son to maintain my identity in remembrance." This declaration is interesting because 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 27 informs us that there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose identity was Tamar. Absalom possessed 3 sons. Yet, when he constructed his monument, he declared he possessed no son. This signifies that by the time Absalom constructed the pillar, all 3 of his sons had perished. This was meaningful in ancient Israel. A man's heritage existed on through his sons. Without a son, your identity would be forgotten. So, Absalom constructed a stone pillar and identified it after himself. The irony is agonizing. Absalom revolted to claim the throne and build his own heritage, but he possessed no sons. He was pursuing for a throne he could not transfer to anyone. All his desires was ultimately for nothing. The monument still remained there as a reminder. People summoned it Absalom's monument, precisely as he had planned. But instead of being a celebration of his significance, it transformed into a testimony to his failure. The stunning prince who had possessed everything concluded up with nothing. No throne, no heritage, no son to remember him, simply a stone pillar and a pile of rocks identifying his disgraceful interment. If this narrative of treachery, verdict, and tragedy affected you, don't maintain it to yourself. Press that subscribe button to accompany us as we persist exploring the powerful narratives of Scripture that formed history and disclose God's hand in human matters. Share this video with someone who requires to perceive how desires without intelligence results in destruction, and how the repercussions of transgression ripple through generations. Leave a comment informing us what impressed you most about Absalom's narrative. Was it his tolerance in strategizing, his ability in control, or the devastating conclusion of a man who possessed no successor to remember him? We'll observe you in the next biblical exploration. Until then, remember, genuine significance is not measured by the chariots we travel or the crowds we direct, but by the heritage we abandon in the emotions of those who genuinely understand us.